everyone, and welcome to a time with your favorite co-host. It's been a long day, so if I'm a little bit off right now, that's probably what it is. But welcome to Perspectives with your host. I am Martina, and this is the lovely
Lisette.
Yes, and thank you all for being here today, whether you're listening via Spotify or iTunes, or if you're watching us on YouTube, or if you're doing both of those things. We thank you for being here today, and we are very excited. We have a great guest with us. We have a wonderful female pastor who has been in ministry for quite some time, and we wanted to have her on because we wanted to get into the topic of faith and ministry, and specifically around women leaders who are doing this work. And before we get into talking with Pastor Gabby, I'll kick it over to Lisette to add anything in.
Yeah, I think this is actually, our first conversation with a woman who's in faith, who's a faith leader. So we are fortunate to have Pastor Gabby with us, and I'll turn it over to her shortly to share a little bit about who she is, what she does. But as Martina mentioned, this is something that we've been talking about doing and wanting to have, because we both are spiritual individuals, grew up in church. We've shared a little bit on our podcast, a little bit of some of that upbringing and what impact that has had. And one of the things that I've always kind of talked about, or even just personally with friends and things, is about sometimes how hard it can be to be a woman in church, especially if you're wanting to be a leader and kind of be a pastor and speak and have sermons and things like that. So I'm glad that we're having this conversation, not just about talking about the barriers, but also like what is happening in the church today. Like what is happening, what is changing, what is going on with women in church, and like how it's becoming definitely a space more open to it, at least from some of the things I've seen and some of the spaces I've been. So I'm excited to have this first conversation of what I'm sure will be many to come. But as I had mentioned, we have our guest today, who is Pastor Gabby. We had a chance to connect with her prior to recording, and we are excited to hear for you all to hear about her journey, what she's passionate about, and just really what she has to say about being a church leader, and being, especially in today's day and age of where we're at as far as faith in this country, and where women fall into that. So I'm excited to have her share a little bit about that. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Pastor Gabby. Give you a chance to introduce yourself. Tell us who you are, where you're at, because you're not in Chicago like Martina and I are at. So you can let us know a little bit about that, and then we'll kind of get into the conversation.
Yeah, I love it. First of all, thank you all for having me. Lisette, Martina, it's just a joy to be with you. Shout out to everybody who listens to the podcast. It's really great to be with you all as well. As they mentioned, no, I am not based in Chicago, though Chicago is one of my favorite cities, especially in the summertime. I love Chicago. I was there last month for some events. Matter of fact, I kicked off my book tour in Chicago last month. That's how much I love Chicago.
Oh, yeah.
But I am based in Brooklyn, New York. I'm a New York City girl. I've been living in New York for over 15 years. And so even though it is not my place of origin, although funny enough, I was born in Queens. So I can't say it's not my place of birth, because it is. But I spent my adolescence in the South. My family moved to Texas when I was very young. So shout out to Dallas, that's where I'm from. I feel like wherever you went to high school with, that's where you're from, because people always want to know those kinds of questions. So shout out to my hometown of Dallas. My mother still lives there, but I have been living in New York, spent first 12 of my 15 years in Harlem, and I've been in Brooklyn for about 3.5 years now. And I am a pastor. As Lisette and Martina mentioned, I am a pastor. I am currently a founding pastor of a church that I started. And prior to that, I was on staff at a pretty large church in New York as a young adult pastor. And so I'm a lead pastor now. And it's just great to be with you all.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. So I guess like just to kick off our conversation, what brought you to ministry? Was it something you always knew you were going to go into? Was it a family kind of thing? Because I know most people that become pastors usually have family members who are in the ministry. So I'm just curious.
Yeah. So I have two answers to that question. The first is yes. My mother is actually a minister. However, that's not what brought me to the ministry. So it allowed ministry to not feel foreign to me because I grew up as the daughter of a minister. However, I actually didn't see myself going down that pathway. So what brought me to ministry is really interesting. I kind of had an interesting journey into ministry. I have always been passionate about music, and from a younger age, I was always really intrigued by gospel music. And so I'm in my 30s. So at the turn of the century in the year 2000, sounds like forever ago, but in the year 2000, I was 15 years old. And this is when like Mary Mary, Kirk Franklin, Yolanda Adams, Ty Tribbett, all of them were like new. Out of all of them, Kirk was the oldest of them. And even with him, he was like 6 or 7 years into his career. And so there was just this movement of younger gospel music artists who were getting played on like R&B and hip hop stations, who were definitely gospel intentionally, but they were like selling out stadiums and just showing up, wearing like clothing that didn't feel like church clothing, but just felt like, stuff for the culture. And they were just kind of, very, very present. I remember like Mary Mary had like their first song Shackles was on like MTV, like some commercial for MTV or whatever. So I came of age kind of in that era. So I quickly decided that I wanted to work in gospel music with those kinds of artists. And I wanted to just kind of keep getting their music out there because I was so moved by it. So in college, I worked at the radio station for 3 years, our campus radio station. I was gospel morning show host. It was very fun. And in that role, I basically met all the gospel acts that would come through Hampton, Virginia. I went to Hampton University. So by the time I was a senior in college, I knew I wanted to work in the music industry. So I literally only applied to one graduate school, which stressed my family out because it was like that or bust. But I was a very determined 21-year-old. I was like, I'm going to get in. It's going to be great. Everybody calm down. So I applied to NYU. And they had a master's in music business program, which is a very small program, which made it even more selective. They take like 30 students a year. I was far more bold than I realized, as when you get older and look back, you'd be like, wow, that was a risk. We're glad it worked out. But, it worked out. So I went straight from Hampton to New York. That's how I got to New York. I've been here ever since. And so I really saw my career as a publicist as ministry. I really did, because I basically felt that I was spreading, the gospel and the good news through music, through entertainment, through that lane. I did a lot of work with like BT and other places, Viacom. Sorry if y'all can hear that. I'm in New York, so you might hear the sounds of the city.
It's all right. We're in Chicago.
Okay, cool.
I closed down my window a little bit.
Listen, you understand me. Okay, what's understood don't need to be explained. Exactly. Perfect. So I was doing that work. And while I was doing that work, funny enough, I actually was looking for a church home. But because of my career, a lot of my weekdays and weekends were taken up with gigs. But there was a church in Queens that had a young adult Bible study on Friday nights. And ironically, Friday night was like the one night that I didn't have gigs or didn't have things that I had to be at. So I started attending that just as a layperson. And very quickly, word got out what I did professionally, because the church was a church that was known for their own music ministry. And a lot of the folks that sang at that church also sang back up for some of the artists that I was working with. So very quickly, people kind of knew what work I was about. Which turned into me like being like a lay volunteer, which is basically an unordained volunteer with the young adult ministry, because they were throwing events and just needed some support, and it was my lane, and it all worked out. And I did that for 5 years, and then after 5 years of doing that, the person in the seat actually got moved to another church. And so by this point, They're about to fill the new seat. And instead of hiring externally, which they could have, there was a lot of demand for the role, my pastors decided to hire internally. So I ended up getting hired, and my husband ended up getting hired as a co-young adult pastoral model, which they had never done before. And I hadn't even been licensed to preach yet. That would come later, but it was very like different. It's a different way of moving. And it was very instant. Because this church was at such a high level of just kind of who was watching the church and the work that was being done, that I was really thrown into a role that most people would probably get, midway through their ministry. I started at a very high level. And so, the rest is history. I got licensed, went to divinity school, the whole nine. But really, I think it's fascinating. But, my pulpit call really grew out of just like the ministerial call that I felt vocationally as a layperson, and just being very present and being very committed. Ultimately, God did show me a call to the pulpit. But, I say that to say, like, whatever work that you do for God, like, regardless of whether it's in the pulpit or not, like, do it to the highest level, and you never know where that is going to take you.
Go ahead, Martina.
Okay, I had a more, I'm interested in hearing a little bit more, like going from Hampton, Virginia into New York City, because I'm a person that came from a small town in Mississippi and ended up in Chicago. And I just wonder, how was that for you, coming from kind of this little small town into this big city? And I think you kind of knew what your mission was, but then of course you found it over time. How was that?
I mean, it really wasn't that big of a deal. I mean, I'm not from Hampton. I'm from Dallas. So, I went to college in Hampton, but it really was not that big of a shift, to be honest. I think that, cities larger and smaller, they kind of have a similar like pulse and energy behind them. So I found my rhythm very quickly. I adjusted really quickly to New York. So it wasn't that bad for me.
Lisette, go ahead. Your question.
No, I think one of the things that struck me was when you said, my ministry calling, I found it, thought it was music, right? And I think people forget sometimes that, like you mentioned, like whatever you do for God, like you can do it in so many different ways. Like ministry isn't just being a pastor, being in the pulpit. Like ministry is so many different things. I just wanted to comment on that because it's something that I think a lot of people in church, whether you're young or older, always confuse that. Your ministry can be baking, right? Like your ministry can be cooking, like, and all these different things, and sometimes you kind of get a little maybe just like feeling stuck or something, because you're like, oh man, what am I supposed to be doing? And you're already doing it and you just don't realize it, because the church has really led into this thing, like, unless you're leading, or you're in the pulpit, or you're in some kind of like leadership position in the church, you're not really doing ministries. It's just something that struck me when you were talking.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, that first half of my career was ministry. It just wasn't in the pulpit.
Mm-hmm. So when you think about like getting to the pulpit, like what was that journey like? I know you said, was it going from just being a like youth pastor and then just transitioning it to being a pastor? How did that transition happen for you?
The transition into can you give me that question again?
Yeah, the transition from like leading like youth and being like, it sounds like a youth pastor, then to becoming, a pastor of a church, and like founding a church and like kind of doing that. Was that just natural? It just kind of happened over time, or was it intentional?
So I should clarify. So I was a young adult pastor, which means I had folks between the ages of 21 to 39. So gotcha. I was serving at a mega church, and this demographic made up a large portion of that church. So that work was pastoral. There really was nothing pastorally required of me at that level that isn't required of me now that I'm in the senior seat.
Gotcha.
The difference is the senior pastors hired me, and of course I'm serving their vision, but I have capacity to create vision for those that I serve because it was a good model. But at the end of the day, they are the senior pastors, and so the buck stops with them, right? So I would say the shift from being on staff as a pastor to being a lead pastor, it was a shift more so in what's required of me by God, because my responsibility is now for a larger demographic of folks. But the work itself is really quite similar. But the responsibility of who I am responsible for and who I am training and who I am leading and who I am pastoring, that certainly takes on another level. It would be like with any other field. If you move into, let's say you were vice president and then you become president, well, a lot of those mechanics are going to be similar, but the level of visibility, the level of, if stuff goes wrong, it goes to you first. If stuff goes right, it goes to you first, right? And I would say that that's a very similar parallel to moving from a staff pastoral model to a senior or lead pastoral model, depending on what language people use. And that was a big shift in just allowing myself to grow in that way. Anybody that steps into a more senior lead seat than what they had previously, you have to give yourself space to grow. Give yourself space to sometimes feel overwhelmed, sometimes not know exactly what the right call is, but to know that you've been placed in that position for a reason. And to not let that fear or that concern about getting everything right keep you from doing what you need to do. That was definitely, and still is, I'm about to be 4 years into this church that we started in November. November makes 4 years, and I'm still, very much always talking to colleagues and mentors who've been pastoring for 50 years. I'm sure enough gonna ask them some questions and try to learn from their wisdom, and so on.
Martiana, have you got anything?
I have a few questions. I think I was trying to formulate them really, and just listening to you, Pastor Gabby, you appear and seem to be very personable and someone that I could see people turn into in a time just to want to talk to. And so when you were beginning your journey up until now, I'm just interested to know, have others come to you for mentorship, come to you for advice about wanting to get into ministry, in particular, have those been women, or have those been women of color, or, maybe they're younger women or older women. It really doesn't matter. I think when people get that feeling that this is right for them, it can happen anytime. So just interested in that and how you have handled those different situations.
Great question. So 2023 marks 10 years in pulpit ministry for me. And in those 10 years, I think I've probably walked with or mentored at least 12 to 15 folks who are now in the ministry, which is a very humbling thing. And that doesn't happen all the time. I think that God has gifted me with the ability to see a ministerial call in other people and to walk with them. To your question about, gender and race, they've all been Black folks, but they've been a majority women. There are some men in that count, but they've been majority women. And one of the things I'm most proud about in my church that I started with my husband, Double Love Experience Church in Brooklyn, we have a ministerial fellowship program where we have we've trained 5 ministerial fellows, and we have 2 right now. Out of those 7, 6 of them are women. And that was not intentionally, let's just train women. It was like, let's train the best candidates. And that's just how it fell. And it has been such a beautiful experience to watch each of them find their voice and really empower and embolden themselves to show up fully behind the pulpit. And so, I have 2 fellows right now that are with me. One is a student at Union Seminary in New York. The other is a student at Yale Divinity School, my alma mater. And they're brilliant. And it's just, it's so refreshing to be able to guide people who are accepting their call younger and who are ready to do this pastoral work and who are Black women and finding their space. One of my fellows said she had never seen a Black woman pastor until she got to her senior year of college. And she's now in her going into her second year of seminary. She's 24 years old. And there's so many stories like that. So I love those moments. It's something that was kind of naturally baked in for me because I'm the daughter of a minister, but I also saw the issues that my mother faced in ministry. So even though I'm a daughter of a minister and I understand how ministry can be impactful for women, I've also seen the struggles. And so I'm able to bring both of those things to the table when I'm trying to guide younger clergy.
I think it's really important what you just said and all that, because for me, I grew up Southern Baptist in Mississippi, and in that pulpit, it was primarily Black men. I cannot remember the first time I actually started to know that there were women out there who were pastors. It's just something I didn't see growing up in the South, especially just being in the quote unquote Black church in the South. You saw Black women maybe cooking or doing Bible study, choir rehearsal, but when it came to the preaching and the ministry, that was men. And so I agree with that. With the young lady that you saw, I was probably into my early 20s as well when I finally was like, they have Black Black women that are pastors. We got women that are pastors. And it was really mind blowing because, most of the time, again, for me, it's just something I didn't see. And so I think now, hopefully it seems to be with you and the individuals that you're helping to mentor and that they will begin to mentor as well. We're seeing a change in the tides.
Yeah.
Likely.
Yeah, there's definitely, I don't know how closely you all may follow T.D. Jakes' ministry, but he had a powerful moment at his last Women That Were at Loose conference where he, on the pulpit, said that he was kind of passing the baton to his daughter. And while some people would say, oh, of course, that makes sense, she's a pastor, you have to recognize the revolutionary moment that's happening. Because a lot of times when Black male clergy pass on anything to their children, if it goes to a woman, it's usually because they don't have any male sons. Jakes has 2 daughters and 2 sons, biological. He has a ton of spiritual sons, people who, he has trained in the ministry. And so, sometimes we can't get so familiar with, what we've seen that we forget about its significance. It is significant to verbally say, I'm passing to you what I have to give you as you are the next person to take us further. And you happen to be how old is she? 33, something like that, young woman pastor. So, those moments are happening more frequently and more publicly. And they're really important. And my hope is that they will normalize things for generations behind us. So the same way in 2008, we'd never seen a Black president. And now kids who are coming up now, they know of the Obamas, they know of Kamala Harris, they know of Ketanji Brown. Like they're going to have other battles to face, but at least there's some normative visibility at the Supreme Court level, at the VP level, at the presidential level, that younger kids will be like, what do you mean Black folks can't be the president? Like that already happened, right? So that's my hope with women in ministry. Like there's a lot of, things that we've got to move forward in, of course, but there's some things that have been happening in the past 5 or 10 years and that will continue to happen that are hopefully breaking down some of the stereotypes and making some things normative about women in the pulpit for younger generations that I hope it's a different conversation, a different battle that has to be faced than what has been, the ongoing saga of I'm X years old and never seen a woman pastor, right? Which is a much more common, experience than not for a lot of people.
Go ahead, listen. I could ask another one, but I've asked 2 back to back.
Well, I think I just want to comment to what, has been said. Because I think a lot of women who grew up in churches, like I grew up in church, was a church kid, and still am a church person, but it was probably until after college where I realized like, oh, women are leading, churches, they are, preaching, and they are pastors. They're called pastors. They're not, something else, or just, on a on a Christmas service, they're gonna like preach, or like on a Mother's Day kind of thing, doing that. So I think to your point, Pastor Gabby, of just making it the norm just across the church, because I think even if you look at whether, you're evangelical church or a Baptist church, there's this very male dominated kind of picture that you see of who is leading a lot of these churches. And women are just kind of are starting to be sprinkled in, and you're starting to see things kind of change. And to your point, like these young women who are now are like, oh, I can actually follow my callings. I think a lot of times some women probably never follow their calling, and they had so many great things to share and wisdom and just words of God, because there was a barrier there. And to hear now, like, you're seeing women, not even intentionally, just women coming through because of the space that you've made and sort of the environment that you've created as pastors. Because I think you and your husband are co-lead pastors.
We are, yes.
Because I remember I went to your website. I did a little
Thank you. I love it. A little research. I love a little research.
I was like, I wanted to learn a little bit more about your church.
I love it.
So I was like, and to hear you speak about it, just the space that you're creating, and like you said, like if you create it, if you're intentional of creating these spaces, people, whether of all races, sexes, will feel comfortable and will feel able to like follow their calling and be in their ministries. It's just, I don't have a question. I just wanted to comment on that, because it just makes me happy as someone who grew up in church, not seeing that often enough, and really seeing the negative impact of what a male dominated infrastructure really does to a church. Like I was like, oh man, like women should be out there because they have a different, just different things. So to just see it, I just had a comment on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, Lisette, you brought it up, so I want to continue to know a little bit. I mean, we've looked you up, of course, but I would love for our viewers and listeners to get some backstory on you and your husband, because you both do this together. You both tag teams. I would love to kind of hear a little bit more. How did you meet? I think you touched on it a little bit earlier, how you met. But love to know a little bit more of that story, and how did you both get to this moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So my husband's name is Andrew Wilkes, Reverend Andrew Wilkes. And Andrew and I went to Hampton together. That's where we met, started dating there. When I came to grad school in New York, he went directly into seminary at Princeton Seminary. So if you know the New York area, Princeton and New York City and Princeton, New Jersey are about an hour and a half by train. So we did those 3 years. I don't know if you can call it long distance, because real long distance people really get on us. They be like, y'all were in long distance. You can get on the train. I don't know. I want to start no problems. But it was long distance for us.
That's long distance to me. I'm like,
You defined it.
It took effort. We had to be intentional. But
yeah, you have to be intentional.
That's what I'm saying.
An hour and a half. Yeah.
Put some respect on our commute. That's what I tell people.
Yeah.
So, so we were in grad school at the same time, still dating. And then we got married after grad school, which is interesting because I think that for generations before us, that timeline is pretty normative. But for our generation, it was kind of like people felt like it was a little early that we got married, because we got married. I was 2 weeks away from being 25. So I was 24 years old. And so we've been married now 12 years. And in the beginning of our marriage, I was a publicist. So that was like my how I made money. That was my work. And he was a minister, but he also is a public policy aficionado. So he went right into a public affairs fellowship after seminary, and did some work at, some high levels. And so he kind of blends, faith and public policy. And so he was doing, a little bit of that work. And so it wasn't until 2013 when we were hired at the church I was speaking about earlier, that we began doing ministry together. So we got together in 2005. So, I tell people that even though this phase of our journey has us in a similar career, which is wonderful. I love working with my husband. It's not like when we got together, that was a plan or a goal or even thought of, right? And I think people should be careful about trying to like pre-imagine like what your future is going to look like with your person. Like just think about compatibility first. And, are you all going to end up on the same pathway later? Maybe, maybe not, right? I have a lot of girlfriends who are pastors whose husbands are not in the ministry at all. And it works, So I just want to say that like, because we now do ministry together, it kind of looks like it was this grandiose plan, and it was not. It really was not. But, since 2013, we've been serving together in pastoral ministry, and it's been great. We just wrote a book together, and, we in our church, we preach together once a month, and then we rotate the other week, who's preaching. So we don't preach together all the time, but it is something that we do. It's something that's still new to some people, tag team preaching. But we enjoy that, when we get a chance to do that. And so, it's been a good journey.
That sounds fascinating. I did not know that he was a public policy.
He's literally finishing his PhD in political science right now. So he's been an executive director of a nonprofit before. He's worked in the mayor's office before,
awesome.
Done all that good stuff. So
kudos to him. He might need to come on eventually here too, because he's
that's what I was thinking.
I know he's doing. Yeah, both of y'all are out here just really.
I'm sure he would be happy to.
Yeah. So, touching on that about, you being in ministry with your husband, and it wasn't intentional that, that you met him way back when, and now you ended up being this together. How has it been? To me, it seems like, if everything is not going according to plan, you have a shoulder to cry on or to lean on, because he gets it. But I'm sure there are times that he may not always get it, or you may not always get it with him. So how has that relationship been for you all in terms of the ministry?
Yeah, I think that doing ministry together as a married couple is tough, because you have to realize that everyone has a different paradigm for what they think marriage looks like and should be. And people like to project that on married couples. Mm-hmm. And so, the paradigm, you both said that it wasn't until your 20s that you saw a woman in ministry, right? So the paradigm that people most understand for married couples in the church is pastor and first lady. So that is not the paradigm that we use. And yet I get where it comes from when that's people's first inclination, right? Mm-hmm. So, being married in ministry, it has its positives, because we have each other, and that's a beautiful thing. But it also has its challenges in differentiation, right? Like, we are two very different individuals who are formed very differently, who approach the work of ministry very differently. And now that, that those differences complement each other. So we show up well together, but we're not the same person. We're not interchangeable. You don't swap one Wilkes for the other, or, and so all of these ways in which people understand couples show up in a very interesting way when you start dealing with clergy couples, right? And so what Andrew and I, go to great pains to do is to really make clear to people what our expectations are, how we show up, how we engage one another, how we expect to be engaged. We're always making that clear. And, some people get it and it works. Others are committed to another kind of narrative. And for people who are committed to another kind of narrative that they need to be true, those aren't our people.
Yeah, we ain't for that.
And we just, God bless you, and we keep going. Because church can be a very gendered space where like the men are here and the women are here. And it can get a little bit toxic at times. And so we have to always kind of do our due diligence about what spaces we're going into. And if they don't align with how we show up, we make different decisions. So that makes the ministry dimension of our marriage complicated. But what I will say, the positive about being married and being in ministry together is, yes, we do, really understand one another. We have to kind of turn it off when we get home. Otherwise, you'll always be talking about work. It's kind of like, people have kids and the kids go off to college and they have nothing to talk about with each other because, they've only been talking about their kids for the past 20 years. Same thing with the church. The church becomes, like a child and something you have to feed and nurture and grow and be on call and be responsive to. And if you're not careful, a lot of clergy couples get very work centered in a way that they don't have their intimacy and their marriage, as a separate thing that they're watering and tending to. And so we try to do that as much as we can. And nobody's perfect at that, but it's also a challenge that comes with, working together, especially with something like the church, because the church is such an intimate part of people's lives. So it transgresses different boundaries than if we were working together in a different kind of field. So it's always a work in progress, always a journey. But it's one that we do feel called to. And, it makes us proud to present another option of what, two married folks who are called, can look like.
Very well said. Very well said.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, I love what you talked about, like, kind of making sure that you have your space, right? Like you kind of separate what you do at church and kind of your home life this is us too. Because I'm not married, but I hear a lot of other people who are in either friend circles or just, people that are older who do struggle with sort of like, well, what do we talk about now?
Yeah.
Or, because you weren't intentional about creating this other space, and you hear a lot about it, and definitely within the church, right? Especially those that are leading and having that where, you see either very publicly what can happen, or, if you're in a small church, you kind of hear and see. So to kind of see you all give, like, here's what two people who love God, who are called to ministry are doing. But also, I'm sure y'all give some counseling and you kind of provide some of that too. And just either by example, like to say, like, there are ways to be your own individual self. Yes. and be that and keep that and still be able to do what you're supposed to do. So just, I love what you just said all around, because as someone who may someday be married, I always seek the advice and sort of wisdom of those that are. So definitely taking that nugget and just kind of putting it in my subconscious for if I ever happen to get married in the future. So I hope others enjoy that too.
Yes.
But I think we're kind of wrapping up this first episode with Pastor Gabby, which has been already amazing. And I'm super excited to do part 2, where we kind of dig in a little bit more into maybe a little bit more about your church and what your church does. Like I read your vision and everything. I was like, oh my goodness, this is some radical words in here. When it comes to a church.
Yes.
I was like, you don't see a lot of, churches putting things out there like that. But I'd love to hear about that. We're definitely digging into more of women in ministry and sort of what you have seen. You touched a little bit on it, so I'm excited to hear a little bit. But Martina, are there any final thoughts from your end?
No, just really, again, thank you for coming on, Pastor Gabby, and everyone sit tight. We'll be back. I know you're viewing this a week apart, but come back for part 2, because part 1 is already awesome, just like Lisette just said. I've learned some things, and you are really good at giving advice. And so I can just see it, like listening to you. I feel like I'm just taking in stuff myself, kind of, the same as Lisette, just thinking about a lot of things. And so we will continue this wonderful conversation. And that's all I got for now. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for joining us, for listening in. Make sure you're following us, whether it's Facebook or Instagram, or you're subscribed to YouTube so you get alerted when Pastor Gabby's next episode is out. So make sure you do that. Thank you all again, and we will see and talk to you next time.